How's it going, everyone? And welcome to the Eminence Legacy podcast. My name is Alfonso Cadena, and I'm joined here by my co-host today.
Jose Luis Cadena, and thank you for joining us.
Awesome. All right, so empathy, right? That's one of the things that, uh, we a lot of times we go for so long without talking to someone because things escalated, right? And it gets to the point where we don't want to address it anymore because either we stay upset or we want to wait for the other person to approach us first, and a lot of times we forget, that it was something so minimal, something that could have probably been avoided or could have prevented from escalation, how we started with something so basic as empathy, right? How do we approach the conversation? So one of the things I was, what I learned about looking into this was that there's different types of empathy, and what I found so interesting about this, I think it's really good to preface is like, okay, so what is empathy? And I think Esther Pearl like provides a really good explanation for it. So you hear about self-awareness, right? So self-awareness is the process in which you analyze your own self and you are able to reach certain conclusions based on the evidence that you see or based on what you observe on your own behaviors and your own thought process, right? But empathy, basically what it comes down to is the opposite of self-awareness, meaning that now you're not just aware about what's going on in your internal being, but you're also aware of what is going on around what is going through the mind of the person that you're interacting with. Is that your experience with empathy?
Well, yeah, it is. It's right on the mark, and we have to remember that we're biased by nature. We're biased whether we want to admit it or not. But usually, the things that we believe in, we're always going to be choosing that over somebody else's ideology or beliefs. In other words, we live our own version of reality. And our own version of reality comes with our senses, with our worldview, with our temperaments and everything. So that's the only real experience that we have of our reality. So when we're talking about empathy, we need to kind of move away from that and understand that there's other people that live other lives, that have other experiences, that have different temperaments and different ideologies than us. So this is where we want to start in understanding that we need to kind of make room for that. Now, I also found that another thing that empathy does, empathy gives you or gives us a reason to help others. Without empathy, you wouldn't have a reason to actually try to help somebody else because you're going to be fixated on maybe that you're right or that maybe that they don't need the help or maybe that they're just whatever it is that you might be thinking. But I think that empathy also gives you the ability to help others.
And the good thing about seeing it from that perspective is that no longer is it important to find out who's the culprit in the matter. It really comes down to, okay, so this person is expressing a concern. What is the root? What is the root of that problem? And at that, once you figure out, well, okay, what is causing this issue, then it no longer becomes an issue about whose fault is it, but okay, it already happened, but how are we going to resolve it? And I think that's where it becomes important to understand the different types of empathy. And I think you nailed it when you said that we all come with our biases, because it comes to like the first type of empathy that Pearl actually mentions, which is cognitive empathy, right? So like just how we premise your side. So we already have some biases that we are going to start with, right? So when somebody comes in and expresses to us our problem, our first reaction a lot of times is to assume that it's exactly the same of what we're going through. And that could be, and I can see situations where that's actually helpful because let's say somebody's coming to you and asking for advice about, how to be as successful or to get to the position where you are now. Well, in that case, then they're specifically asking you about your own personal experience, and you're empathizing with the person who's aspiring to be in the position that you're in, and as a result, you're providing them that guidance that is really one-sided based on your experience. But that was because the question was specifically framed that way, right? But that doesn't mean that it's like the famous saying that goes to a hammer, everything's a nail, right? We cannot respond to everything the same way. So when somebody approaches you with like whether it's a concern or a question or for insight, whether it's advice or just bringing up something that they would like to have resolved, we can't always respond through cognitive empathy because what that often leads to is it's a situation where where the person is going to feel unheard because rather than you empathizing and putting yourself on their shoes, you're simply seeing it from your perspective and wanting to relate your own experience. And just like you said, I mean, we have different worldviews, different points of views, and it's not going to necessarily be the same experience that they're going through.
It's all about perspective. When it comes down to it, it's about the perspective of the person that's going through whatever it is that they're going through, or whatever it is that they're experiencing. And again, we have to remember that my character might do a might walk through something in a different way than somebody else's character. We all have different abilities and different qualities, and we all have different, I guess, points where we're able to handle, you know, some things better than others. So that's where we need to kind of think about it. It's also, it's when we think empathy, I think we need to think perspective as well.
Right. Absolutely. Now, the other type is also that it would a lot of times be helpful because would be compassionate empathy. And the reason for that is because again, like you have to think about what the situation is and how it is that you're going to respond to this. So, this basically proves valuable in situations where someone is coming for you uh, for advice. In which case, you're going to try to you know to listen to them in an empathetic way, in the sense of like that you're aware of their situation, you're paying attention to the nuances, and you're being reflective of what it is their concerns are, and you're responding from their point of view. Right. So again, like I mean, like it really comes down to um, how what is that the person is expecting of you. One of the things that my pastor says that I think is really really smart. He says like, if you're gonna come from me, every time somebody comes from me for advice, I ask them, are you here to ask me for advice, or are you here just to tell me what it is that you're going to do? Because I mean, if you're gonna, and the reason he brings that up is because he says like, if we're gonna spend 2 hours, discussing something, but you're not gonna want me to, if you're not planning to take any advice and you've already made up your mind, then at least I know that I just need to listen. And a lot of times, as blunt as that might sound, it proves very useful because a lot of times, the person might just want to be heard, right? And other times they might actually want your input, and advice.
It's very important to understand, I guess, what the person is looking for. And I think that's where like the compassion comes from, because you kind of like are not being judgmental. You're more like trying to walk them through the situation, or you're also trying to better understand and analyze what is it that they're trying to, I guess, to resolve, or they're trying to push past. So I think that it's very important for us to always, I guess, be an active listener, and ask the right questions, so we know what it is that we need to be looking for here when it comes to the conversation. And I think this is like empathy creates this better communication flow, and allows you to communicate better by using empathy.
Right. Yeah, and like we started this conversation, right? So a lot of times is because, if you're always responding like in like in a cognitive way where you're simply just trying to insert your point of view, then in that case it becomes very the person that you're speaking with is going to become resentful, thinking, well, I mean, it's because he never listens, so it's because, like I try to tell him something, but it just doesn't get across, versus like, I mean, if you kind of like understand, what the purpose, what the other person is going through and what it is that they're trying to communicate, and how they want to be helped, then you know how to respond, right? So meaning that it's not saying that one of these are better than the other. It's just that you're going to respond to each one according to the situation.
I was thinking about that while you were saying that. A lot of times, uh, when you repeat the question to them or what they said, just to make sure that you understood what they were saying. A lot of times they come up with their own solutions, or they understand how maybe it's irrational what they're thinking. So, for instance, if I say something to the effect, so you're saying that the way you feel is, and then I kind of like um tell them again what they like, I guess uh, tell them again what they were talking about, like word by word, like tell them exactly what they told me, asking them the question. I think a lot of times that's gonna create a bigger impact on the way they feel about it, because they see and they understand you're paying attention. And sometimes when they listen to what they said, they're gonna react and say, you know what, now that I think about it, maybe I am making a big deal, or maybe now that I think about it, maybe I can resolve it by doing this. Because a lot of times we get stuck in our own thoughts. And when we kind of like talk to somebody else, and if it's an active listener, they might be able to just walk you through it.
Right. Yeah, no, because yeah, there's a big power to like verbalizing what it is that you're saying, and you realize, when you're having to actually explain it to someone, then then you realize more or less how much you've actually thought it through. Because if you're not able to explain it concisely within a sentence or two sentences, then you'll come to the realization that maybe you haven't put as much thought of it to this as as you thought you might have. Right. And I see this very often, when I hear in like interviews amongst people, right? Especially like they'll start uh they'll start talking about about them having plans, but then they just say plans is like, oh, what are like, let's say for example with young people, so like, what are your plans? Is like, oh, I'm planning to go to college. Okay, and study. Oh, I'm probably going to study like psychology. And then you're going to do what? Because like, I don't know, become a therapist, and then they're, I follow up the question. It's like, okay, so you're planning to be in school for 6 years, or 8 years, as long as it might take. And then they might say it was like, well, no, I was thinking more about like 2 or maybe 4. Or actually, I haven't thought that far. Well, in that case, then like the more you start probing, you realize that that is like that there's a vision, but there's not necessarily a plan to it. And the difference between the two is that the vision is like you can get more or less an idea of what you want the final outcome to be, but an actual plan is going to have steps in between on how to get there.
Yeah, most definitely.
Right. So, and then there's also lastly like emotional empathy, which is something that Pearl, like the author, writes about, which is basically just coming down to the level where you're simply feeling what the person is feeling, and not necessarily giving any input to that, but rather than just being a listener and just going ahead and going through the moment with that person. Which so a lot of times, especially in times of grieving, is an important thing to do because, again, I mean, what can you say really? I mean, and as much as we might think that we've been through that before for a similar situation, the truth is that not everybody's going to process it the same way. So just because it was like similar circumstances doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a similar experience to the other person.
Yeah, I really think that that's very important to remember, because a lot of times we kind of throw off, like they're telling us something, and we kind of throw our story out there and make it seem like it was something simple or whatnot. But at the end of the day, uh, everybody's different. Everybody's built different. Everybody sees the world differently. So something that might have been easy for us, or we might have overcome it a certain way, might not work for the other person. So we need to be very conscious of when we're kind of like having this dialogue with the person. And when it comes to emotion, I think we need to remember about, or we've had topics about emotional intelligence, how we need to be objective all the time, as far as our emotions are real, they're real things, but sometimes they might get in the way of trying to show that empathy. For instance, if you're upset at the person because maybe they didn't come through for you, or maybe they let you down, or maybe they did something that, I mean, that you that hurt you at the end, we kind of let that emotion overshadow the purpose of trying to work for a resolution or work for bettering that situation. And sometimes our emotions will just make things worse. So we need to remember that when it comes to uh, emotional empathy, we need to try to get the perspective of the other person and what they might be feeling. And a lot of times, I mean, I don't believe anybody wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I'm waking up today and I'm gonna make sure to get Jose Luis mad, right? Nobody wakes up, oh, I'm gonna go and make Alfonso make him have a bad day. Nobody wakes up with that mentality. Things sometimes just happen like that. Sometimes a person it might not be having a good day. Um, a lot of things like I'm a manager, and what I do sometimes instead of like let's say somebody is usually a good performer, as far as their work and what they do. And if I see that they're kind of decreasing on what they do, I pass them in the office. And first of all, I ask them, hey, how are you doing? How are things at home? And I try to find out how the temperament at home is because a lot of times you're going to see a decline on their work if they're going through issues at home. So before you tell them, hey, by the way, I've noticed that you didn't hit the mark this month and we're kind of behind on the stuff that we needed to do, that's not showing a lot of empathy. That's like not giving him a reason to even want to do better. But if you're able to kind of like ask first and then find out what's the root of the problem, that's me showing a little bit more empathy versus me being emotional or whatever you want to call it, but being a little bit more objective when it comes to things.
Right. Yeah, you cannot be just assuming that you know exactly what's going through someone else's mind. Like you said, I mean, like a lot of times we'll take something personally, thinking that it's directed towards us, but we just can't assume that a lot of times, and sometimes we'll just be healthier human beings if we just not take everything personally all the time and just assume that there could be other factors that are influencing the person's behavior rather than it being directed to us. And a lot of times we'll realize that we'll be happier for it, right? In the end of the day.
I think that it's very important for us to be observant and watch and consider, the other person. Watch with curiosity. Be an active listener. Kind of slow down. A lot of times, we already know what we're gonna say when the other person's talking because we're thinking about it. And we just want them to be quiet so we could go and have our turn. So kind of slow down, listen better, and maybe follow up with some questions so you can better understand the person and open up who you really are. Like, who are you at the very core, like yourself? Like when you're having these discussions, try to be a little bit more transparent as far as that, so you guys could find that common ground to be able to have that conversation in which the communication is better.
Right. And adding to that list of recommendations also, uh, pausing is a big one. It's something that they go over, like, let's say, like if you study like, like education, how to be like an effective teacher. Uh, a lot of times you'll notice whether it's a professor or an instructor of any source that they ask you questions like, oh, are you with me? Do you understand? And then they quickly move on to the other point, like hardly giving you like 5 seconds for you to respond, like, and meaning that you don't even get to ask the question because there was no time in between. And that transfers over to like everyday conversation as well, where we ask something from someone and we want the response right away. And what happens for the sake of filling in that awkward silence in between, that is that we end up jumping into the conversation and adding more, and in the process we end up missing out on important information or something that could have been mentioned that was never mentioned because we were so hasty to quickly fill in the gap of silence. So we need to be comfortable with that, with there being moments of silence in between.
Yeah.
And what you end up realizing is that if you actually had a timer in front of you, you would realize that it's actually not that much time in between. It's just that it seems that way from our perspective. So we're perceiving time differently, but in reality, it's like those milliseconds to few seconds at all. It's really not that much of a time.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah.
Right, and the last point I'm going to go ahead and throw in there is going ahead and replace is going to be to replace advice giving with curiosity. So asking leading questions, like how do you feel about that? Can you tell me more? What do you mean when you say this? What would be helpful? That which is something that we talked about earlier. Is like how is it that how is it that the person wants to be helped? What do you make of it? So like leading questions like that is going to one make the person feel a lot more like better heard, more than the average than if we were to talk to anybody else. Second of all, you would be able to have more information and tools at your disposal to know it's like, okay, this person just wants to be heard, or this person's looking for advice. Um, and the last thing, is just going to create better relationships all around. Like I said, I mean, so many times there's disagreements, disputes, why? Because we couldn't start on this basic concept. Somebody brought something up, and rather than us being curious, we think that it's just a passing comment, but in reality, it's the person trying to communicate something, and we just have to be aware of that.
Yeah. A lot of times we miss the cues that they're telling us, and you have to remember that we have a hard time communicating as it is. In most relationships or interactions, you don't people don't really speak what they're thinking, and when they do speak it, they normally butcher it because they don't. In their mind, it sounds different, and then when it comes out, it sounds offensive. So we need to be very peculiar about those things.
That's right. All right, so that concludes this week's episode. If you would like more shows like this, don't forget to visit patreon.podbean.com/Eminence Legacy. You could also visit eminencelegacy.com where you can schedule some live coaching sessions. There's also different things about general health and wellness. So be sure to check that out. You can find me on Instagram and Cadena Alfonso. Jose Luis, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I would like to I guess let's challenge ourselves to listen more deeply, to seek out the different perspective of people, and to respond to others with kindness and understanding. Empathy isn't always easy, but I think at the end of the day, it's worth the effort. I mean, it's something that all of us are going to struggle with again because we're biased by nature, but we need to try to focus on becoming a better person, a better version of yourself at the end of the day. Sometimes you're going to miss, but the next day you're able to start over. So, we encourage you to keep listening to us and share our podcast. And if there's any topics that you would like for us to share or touch on, please reach out to us. And thank you, and hope that you guys rise to your eminence.
All right, have a good week, everyone.